The year 1536 for King Henry VIII was a very strange one, and one which was turbulent to say the least. As the new year came around, the notorious Tudor King heard news that his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was sick and ill, and on the 7th of January 1536, inside of Kimbolton Castle, the former queen died. Henry VIII dealt with the death of his very popular first wife in the most distasteful way, and he ordered celebrations to not commemorate her life, but instead be jubilant about her death. This paved the way for Henry VIII to do what he wanted, now the looming spectre that was Catherine and her time as queen was out of the way, and Henry VIII was now married to Anne Boleyn, who was declared by law to be the lawful and rightful Queen of England. Catherine's death ended over a decade of chaos and debate around the validity of her marriage to Henry VIII, due to the fact she was also married to Henry's brother Arthur. But Henry would of course find any reason to get out of this marriage, but within weeks of her death, Henry VIII encountered a horrific accident that could have almost killed him. There was a lot of chaos following Catherine's death, and Henry was over the moon by it, and there were many celebrations and feasts which were played out at court, and there was a large tournament ordered to celebrate the king's dancing on the grave of his former wife. As always, Henry VIII was a man who wanted to prove his strength and might, and he would in this tournament decide to participate and compete himself, especially on the tilt-yard with a joust. Henry was known for being a fierce jouster, and he would, despite the opposition of others inside of his court, take to the tilt-yard regularly in what was a dangerous sport, with two men charging towards each other on horseback and breakneck speed, armed with a wooden sharp lance. The aim was to knock the other off the horse, but Henry VIII was a sensitive man who was touchy about his physical prowess, and he wanted to prove to Anne Boleyn what a strong and athletic man he was. Anne, his second wife and queen, was at this time pregnant, and Henry on the 24th of January 1536 rode into the field of the tournament wearing shining armour, and he was also on his horse, which was very well armoured. The crowd cheered, and it's considered that Anne Boleyn was not present at this time, and Henry tipped his lance to another lady in the crowd, and she then tried her favour, a good luck charm to this, and this may have been Jane Seymour, the third wife of Henry VIII. It's not known who the king's opponent was that day. It may have been Charles Brandon, a close friend of the king who had fought with Henry on the tilt-yard before. In fact, Henry had been injured before, housing against Charles Brandon, but when the two rode against each other, Henry VIII's opponent got the better of him. They rode at each other very quickly, and then the lances clashed, and Henry was thrown off his horse. The lance smashed against his armour. The crowd gasped and were horrified, and then the heavily armoured horse then collapsed on top of the king, and he was knocked out. Henry VIII was in a bad way, and he was carried unresponsive into the palace, and his injuries were checked. Part of the lance had pierced his leg, but all his other injuries were internal, and because of this the doctors could not treat him in any way. He was knocked out for many hours, and the royal doctors and those of the household believed that Henry VIII had died in the accident. But when Henry VIII finally arose, he was a man who had changed greatly in his personality. It was said, "We believe that his jousting accident of 1536 provides the explanation for his personality change from sporty, promising, generous young prince to cruel, paranoid and vicious tyrant." From that date, the turnover of the wives really speeds up, and people begin to talk about him in quite a new and negative way. After the accident, he was unconscious for about 2 hours. Even 5 minutes of unconsciousness is considered to be a major trauma today. Henry VIII was in a bad way, and many historians have claimed that he suffered a major brain injury which changed his personality. Henry VIII had always been known to have a sharp tongue who made cruel and brutal decisions to execute many people across his kingdom, and he could be ruthless, but in the months after his accident and the years following, he got worse. His cruelty increased, and he had a very wild temper, and he was very erratic, and his wounds never healed on his leg to the point where later in his life he would become immobile. Henry also suffered from very bad headaches, showing the pain caused to his head, and he would also put on a lot of weight, as the injuries to his leg led to him not being as mobile as he once was. But the jousting accident was a real turning point for Henry VIII. The accident also brought him back to earth with a shattering back, physically and literally, as Henry VIII had to now accept that he was not the man he once was. He was not as athletic as he once was, and he was getting older, and it was difficult for him to shake off injuries and heal. He was a man who would have issued in the bedroom, but he also, at the time, had no male heir, and this continued to plague him. Days after the accident, it was claimed that Anne Boleyn sadly miscarried another child, a child who has been said to have been her saviour, as many had gone on to believe that this was a boy, and the son of Henry VIII that he greatly wanted. In the months after, Anne would fall from grace, and she would be accused of a huge number of shocking crimes, including treason and adultery. Much of the downfall of Anne Boleyn is attributed to King Henry's decisions and his erratic nature following the accident, and the king would do nothing to stop it getting his own way. But his mind was playing him, and one former adviser stated that this prince seems tainted, among other vices, with 3 which in a king may be called plagues. The first is that he is so covetous that all the riches in the world would not satisfy him. Hence the ruin of the abbeys, spoil of the churches that had everything to take. Everything is a good prize, and he does not reflect that to make himself rich he has impoverished his people. Thence proceeds the second plague, distrust and fear. This king, knowing how many changes he has made and what tragedies and scandals he has created, would fain keep in favour with everybody, but does not trust a single man, expecting to see them all offended, and he will not cease to dip his hand in blood as long as he doubts his people. The third plague, lightness and inconsistency, has perverted the right of religion, marriage, faith and promise. With regards to the king's crazy year, it was said that injuries to the king's pride became commensurate with treason, which expanded both in its legal definition and in the range of behaviours it covered in practice. Treason was no longer just a case of threats to the crown, it also meant letting the king down or failing to conform to his will. It was in the same year that Anne would lose her head inside the Tower of London, and many tried to stay on the good side of Henry. His fools would try to make him happy. However, some walked on eggshells around the notorious Tudor King, but his accident certainly led to his deteriorating health also. It would be a number of years before Henry VIII died. However, he was a man who was immensely brutal and tyrannical. He was like this for much of his reign, but following the accident he was involved in, he was much worse, and he would act very recklessly and would not care who he offended or executed. In the years following, his marriages would be even more tragic and turbulent, and Henry would execute some of his closest friends such as Thomas Cromwell, an action which he would regret until the day he died. Thank you for watching, and as a support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.